Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second session, as I said, at the 17th Annual Milken Institute Global Conference. My name is Ross Duvall, and I'm the Chief Research Officer at the Milken Institute and will serve as moderator of this session. This session is going to address the U.S. overview. Can the U.S. engine pull the global growth train? And it's fortunate that we have Eric Spiegel on the panel, since Siemens actually manufactures locomotives to help us out. And not only do they manufacture locomotives, they do so in Sacramento, California, correct? Good thing I did my homework. So the good news is that we got my photo updated. I don't look like I'm 39 anymore in the program. We discovered that it had not been updated in 11 years. And my wife reminded me I didn't look like that anymore. This panel has an immense amount of knowledge and expertise and diversity of thought that I want to be able to make sure we share with you. And we're really going to explore in this session whether the U.S. economy can play a more central role in sustaining world economic growth, given that several of the former high-flying BRIC countries and other emerging countries are not growing as rapidly as they previously had been. Some additional good news: in the second half of 2013, the U.S. economy expanded at the strongest pace in any six-month period in the past decade. That's not reported very often. So that was some exceptional news. But when you think about the budget stalemate last October that virtually brought the government to a halt, the good news is we hope that the effects of that will begin to dissipate. But the first quarter's economic readings have been below expectations. Probably some of the weakness is attributable to the bad winter weather, but we're going to sort through how much of that is really the case here. And we're going to analyze where we're headed and address some long-term issues as well. So we have a lot of ground to cover. Look a little bit at manufacturing, innovation in the United States, and human capital policy as we bring that all together. If I could just have slide 6, I just want to hit on a couple of points, and then we'll get into this discussion to let you see what's been happening. So slide 6 shows you a graph that compares the current business cycle for employment relative to previous ones. You can see that this one has lagged behind quite substantially, but some very positive news in that the private sector has now finally recovered all the jobs that were lost during the recession. Early in the recovery, businesses were afraid to commit. They appear to be more ready to do that. And if you look at slide 22, it shows you that recovering light vehicle sales have hit their highest rate since 2007. Last month they came in at 16.3. Consumers have been deferring purchases. There are some signs that they're beginning to make those commitments today. In addition, easing credit conditions are helping. Slide 27, please. This shows you housing starts for both single and multifamily. And while housing starts in the housing market have recovered substantially in terms of percentage terms, if you look at the absolute levels, construction is still at a very low rate. Housing affordability has come down with price increases we've seen, as well as higher mortgage rates. But we are seeing the job gains and equity appreciation, and interest rates are still fairly low. If we look at slide 23, please. As this slide demonstrates, it shows you the weakness in capital goods orders that we saw in late 2012, early 2003. But despite sequestration last fall, orders came back, and it appears there's more confidence being placed in the economy. But if we look at slide 37, we'll see that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has expanded to over $4 trillion with all the various rounds of QE. The Fed announced in December that they'd begin withdrawing about $10 billion a month and have done so ever since then in terms of the tapering. But one question we have to ask, and I hope the panel will help us out, is when will the Fed begin to tighten monetary policy by raising interest rates? Last slide, I want to show you slide 21. We hope to get into a further discussion on this topic, looking at natural gas and crude oil production. Even 5 years ago, very few people would have predicted the extent of the oil and gas shale revolution taking place in the United States. Technological advances in horizontal drilling with hydraulic fracturing have altered the energy landscape in the United States. For example, whereas it costs about $14 to buy a million BTUs worth of natural gas in Europe and $16 in Japan, the same amount of natural gas in the US costs plus or minus $4 per million BTU. So how much advantage does this really afford the United States in terms of manufacturing? Well, with that, let me introduce our panel, as I hope they'll help answer some of those questions. On the far end, we have Jim Moffitt, Chairman and CEO of Deloitte Consulting. Next to him, we have Sarah Quinlan, who is Senior Vice President, Market Insights, MasterCard Advisors. Next to Sarah, we have Bill Simon, President and CEO of Walmart US, and Eric Spiegel, President and CEO of Siemens USA, that happens to manufacture locomotives. I guess I like that because I used to work for 2 railroads, and I get a chance to talk about locomotives pulling the train again. What I thought we'd do, I ran through a couple of the statistics there, but get some discussion on consumer markets. It looked like last fall things were improving. We've seen some weakness throughout the winter. But Bill, what I'd like to do is maybe start with you and get a sense of just what Walmart is seeing. You have a huge customer base, and then I might turn to Sarah. I attended one of the Saturday morning meetings in Bentonville about a decade ago, and I was amazed at how Walmart could tell you what was selling in China and other places of the US and what you were short of. And so you're really looking at things on a real-time basis. Given that, what are you seeing in your markets today? Is there room for encouragement, or is there a bifurcation occurring? What does your data tell you about the consumer today?
Thank you. It's great to be here. We do have a very unique view of the marketplace. We see the customer, 140 million customers a week, their buying habits, their general attitude, and get an opportunity to serve them. Last year was just a year of one sort of shock to the system after the other. I think before last year, most people didn't know what sequestration was and couldn't have imagined the government would shut down the way that it did. There were changes to the financing and funding and EBT and SNAP programs and payroll tax changes that impacted the customer. Last year was a difficult year for them. But what's remarkable and to this day still amazes me is the resilience of the consumer. They are optimistic, have figured out that despite how difficult it may have been for them over the last 6 years, have figured out how to take care of their families. And so as we moved into this year, we started to see some encouraging signs in places. And that was dampened by a very severe winter and winter weather. But in and around those events, I think we're starting to see some encouraging consumer patterns emerge. It is still very lumpy. It is very lumpy. The geographically lumpy, and then the middle and down still very challenged with household income and opportunities to grow.
Thanks, Bill. Sarah, let me turn to you. I know you look very closely at consumer trends. You have an amazing set of data. I wish I had access to that. Maybe we can talk about that later.
We can talk about that.
How do you see the position of the consumer today, especially their credit condition, and what are some of the trends you're seeing in spending patterns?
Well, let's pull up slide number 50, and I'll talk a little bit about what we see. At MasterCard, we see 160 million transactions an hour. My team brings it up it's small data. The team brings it up into total retail spend, including all forms of tender, including cash and check. So behind me, if you see this chart, this is total retail spending ex auto, like the government does it. The difference is when the government comes out, they survey 50,000 businesses. We get every business in the United States, and there's a lot of fragmented businesses. So I want to just give you a little a couple ideas here. First and foremost, you see what happens when the consumer is worried. That's December 2012, when we were going over the fiscal cliff and there was an apocalypse. And you saw that Christmas, the most important time of the year, was crushed. And then fast forward to December 2013, and you see that we didn't have those issues. Remember, they made a deal in the second week of December this past year, and that was the big point about it. The interesting thing, though, the catalyst for the consumer to turn them optimistic was actually gas prices this year. Between September and October, there was a 10% drop year over year in gas prices, and we actually saw the consumer go spend. And what was fascinating is we saw them spend, most importantly, on jewelry, which was the #1 category in October. Now, I know everyone could have been apologizing for something, but that's highly unlikely. It really is discretionary spending, albeit I think also jewelry is necessary. But that being said, it was an extremely important indicator. The other thing, if you pull up slide 52, you can see that this is the important thing, and this is the spending we see right now and you can see that most importantly, what we are doing is we are flying. And this is the first time in 13 months we actually see people purchasing tickets to fly. And we know at MasterCard, when someone takes a flying vacation, they spend double what they spend on a driving vacation. So last summer, everyone took driving vacations. This year, they're taking flying vacations. And that means 2 months later, we see lodging do extremely well. And by the way, only 27% of Americans have a passport, so that money will be spent here in the United States. So you can see, because I see discretionary spending. Now, what I will say, you see that department stores, apparel, and hardware are down. Hardware has been down for 6 months now, and so we actually have been really calling for the end of the housing recovery, because we're also seeing furniture declining as well. So those two things really go hand in hand between purchasing a home. But what we actually do see is we see that and believe that the 100%, the decline you saw if you took the total retail sales, was weather, because of the fact we see this discretionary spending. Because when you look at a heat map, it really was the Midwest, the Northeast, the Great Basin, and the Mid-Atlantic that had negative spending, and the West and the South was great.
Great, thank you. Jim, maybe I could ask you next a question concerning what's happening in U.S. multinationals. You advise a number of them. U.S. corporations have been holding a record amount of cash in their balance sheets.
Yep.
Why haven't they been putting these funds to use? And do you see anything changing in the current environment?
Yeah, thanks. I'll start by saying I'm a pragmatic optimist. All the conditions are there for growth. As you mentioned, cash sitting on the sidelines, corporate profits are up. Cash is actually 4 times more on the sidelines today than in '95, 11 times more than in '79. So the cash is there. But we also talked about the uncertainty. And the reality is the uncertainty has become, we talked about this last year, the new abnormal. And I think companies just have to get used to the fact that there is going to be uncertainty. And they need to have the confidence to invest through that uncertainty. Frankly, I think the risk of doing nothing is greater than the risk of investing to change. Now, when I talk to CEOs across the country, the #1 issue I've heard for the last several years has been on growth. Growth, growth, growth. And growth requires differentiation. Differentiation, more than ever, requires innovation. And innovation takes work. It takes investment. It's skill that has to be infused throughout the organization. Oftentimes, it's frankly cultural. And large cap companies can't just sit on the sidelines and outsource that to small companies and entrepreneurs. They have to participate in the equation. I think there are great opportunities for those to team and form ecosystems of partnerships around that, but the large cap companies have to invest as well. So the key is, I think they need the confidence to move forward through the uncertainty, and I come back to the same point. I think the risk of doing nothing is greater than the risk of investing to change.
Thanks, Jim. Eric, you're in a really unique position in terms of gauging whether businesses are feeling more confident and willing to deploy capital. You have, what, 130 manufacturing facilities in the United States. You make everything from medical devices to big motors to the software that runs them. You told me some very interesting, I would say almost shocking numbers about what's been happening in your company in terms of looking at the order books. I was wondering if you could kind of share with the audience, are we seeing a change? What does your own firm's order books look like?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see a tipping point. If I take a look, from our fiscal year, the first 6 months of this year. So we're mostly in long cycle businesses, very capital intensive. So as you said, power plants, pipelines, oil and gas technologies, manufacturing facilities, hospitals, large commercial buildings, et cetera. Our orders are up for those 6 months over 20% year over year, which tells us that 2015 is going to be a pretty good year because basically something that gets ordered today turns into revenue in about 12 to 18 months. We've seen these orders now for about 6 months. And what's driving that is I think the headline that we're starting to see is that the U.S. is really becoming a low-cost manufacturing environment relative to a lot of other places. We're in 190 countries around the world, and we've been moving a lot of our manufacturing here. In fact, if you take a look just 15 years ago, we basically were a net importer in the U.S. of technologies from around the world. Now the U.S. is, we've quadrupled the size of our U.S. business in the last 15 years, and we're now a net exporter. Last year we exported $6 billion worth of goods, about a $27 billion business total, but we exported about $6 billion. And I think that two areas that think about that we see as really growing, not just because the U.S. is a large market, but as I said, exports are growing, is anything that's energy intensive, because we obviously have lower energy costs, and those are going to be around for a long, long time. Even if we build LNG terminals, I think you're going to see a huge advantage here on energy intensive industries for at least the next couple of decades. So if you're making investments in technologies that are going to be around for 30, 40 years, the U.S. is a great place to be a low-cost player. And secondly, advanced manufacturing. I think if you go back 10, 15 years, everyone was saying the U.S. is going to become a service economy. But what they didn't understand was when you take the manufacturing offshore, the R&D often follows it. And then we lost our innovation edge in many different areas. You're seeing that come back because the U.S. is a great place to marry manufacturing and R&D. And all of our manufacturing facilities, you said we have about 130 in the U.S., have R&D right there on the site. We have centralized R&D as well. But this is a great place because we still have the world's best universities and national labs and things. So it's a great place, especially for advanced manufacturing. And all of the manufacturing now is really software-led. And the U.S. develops about 75% of the new software around the world every year. Exactly. So I think that's going to be a big driver of innovation and growth for U.S. manufacturing.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'd like to welcome Maria Contreras-Sweet to the panel, Administrator from the U.S. Small Business Administration. And let me just add, those of us that have known her are very proud of her recent appointment. Thank you for joining us.
Delighted to be.
We're glad that you're in Washington helping assist the job engine in the U.S. economy, which is really small businesses. We love the big businesses, but small, medium-sized businesses are where the job creation really occurs. And earlier I showed a graph of job growth in this recovery compared to others, and we've just now gotten back to the previous peak in private sector employment. But one of the things that's largely been absent until maybe the past year or so is small businesses being reluctant to add to their payrolls. We've seen a lot of that. And many of them have said that they've had a difficult, challenging time obtaining financing in traditional credit markets. And I know that the SBA has been very active here and that you have been partnering to better serve underserved markets in terms of female, minority, veteran entrepreneurs. Could you give us a sense of whether small business is in a position to have the confidence to begin hiring again and what you're trying to do to aid them?
Thank you for that, Ross. I break it up in two parts. It's a bifurcated strategy for me, at least. And I've only been on the job for 2 weeks. I'm well into my third week now, yes. So bear with me here. But as I see it, we have Main Street businesses, the typical manufacturing from sole proprietor all the way through. And then we have the other channel, which is the high growth companies. And so I'm really pleased that the SBA has something very special that most other countries haven't contemplated yet, and that is this wonderful tool that is the SBA. And I'm growing and growing in appreciation for this tool. And again, what it starts with first is helping small businesses develop a business plan. we have consulting organizations throughout the country, 68 field offices that partner with thousands of centers throughout the country that are there to help small businesses develop their business plan. Because fundamentally, even if you can access capital, but you don't have a sound plan and you don't have a good cash management strategy, it's to no use. So the counseling, then the access to capital. We have loans from for the veterans, as you just mentioned, to encore entrepreneurs, the senior citizens that still want to be productive, to women's programs, for disadvantaged communities and businesses. So there's just a panoply of services that I wish were really more promoted. And then after that, what we do is once you now have the capital and you have the consulting, we help partner you with either the private sector or the government. The government has an enormous spend, and the SBA monitors 23% of it that has been set aside for small businesses. So that's an enormous tool for those who want to diversify their portfolio from the private sector and the public sector. And then after that, if you need to innovate, and you've got a company, but you've got a product and you want to innovate, we have the SBIR, which is the Small Business Innovation and Research Program. If you want to partner with a college and a university, we have the Small Business Transfer Technology Program. And so there are enormous tools there that we can deploy. Other countries now are coming to us to ask us about this, because when the government stands up and says, we will issue a debenture for loans where you really want to spur activity for less than $150,000, we will zero out the fees and we will give you a 90% guarantee. That's enormous stimulus. And then for for veterans, it's $350,000. I don't want to get into the weeds, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that this country has an enormous tool, and what we're doing now more extensively is partnering with the financial institutions, designating many as preferred lenders, preferred SBA lenders, and then we're extending our reach into CDFIs and to the CDCs in the community. And I think that as I talked to Jack Liu on Cabinet, he tells me that this is a remarkable tool and that the Germans, the Brits, the Japanese, all the foreign markets are trying to study what the SBA is doing to help spur economic activity. So thank you for the question and allowing me to plug SBA. Thank you.
Well, it's an important plug.
Ross,
yes,
to add on to that, what's really important is we break out the spending in small businesses, all right? And it has been trending 3 to 5% above total retail spending. And so it's interesting that the consumer actually prefers to also spend this way as well. If you think about it, 83% of jewelry is sold in independent jewelers. Most furniture stores are independent. Your favorite restaurant's a one-off. And so this important building tool of partnering here in the government-private partnership is actually how the consumer is choosing to spend their money in the United States as well, and has been driving this resurgence that we've seen in spending.
Bill, didn't I hear you say that you've been opening more of the smaller stores recently? Do you think there's a connection in the trends? I don't know.
I think there is a trend towards the customer wanting to shop locally and more conveniently. But our big stores still do pretty well too. So we're not.
That's
not
true.
At all disappointed.
Still like those big stores. Sarah, maybe I could ask you to talk a little bit more about the consumer financial position. I know you showed some of the data there. I think slide 31 on ours, and I'm sure you have one too, could help out on that.
Sure. Well, what's really interesting is what I look for in the spending is I look to see that the consumer is doing needs versus wants, right? And it's very important for me to see those things. So you talk about sequestration. I pulled the data last year from March to September to see the effect on the greater Washington area of when sequestration went into effect and people had to be furloughed. By the way, everything went flat. People stopped spending everywhere except for one thing, all right? You can pick the obvious. Yes, alcohol was up 27%. So everyone went drinking. But it is interesting that you really can see these stimuli and how people actually react to it. One of the things that's interesting is we actually are seeing the consumer start to actually use credit for the first time. And we think this is really important. But one of the things I want to mention, though, is that over this, the winter here, which really, the polar vortex was a nightmare. But the biggest thing that was very, very important was financial inclusion. And we still know that the moderate consumer does not have enough access to be able to shop online. Very critical. And one of the things I want to pull up is I'm going to get my slide numbers right here, sorry. Slide number 55, all right? And the reason I'm pulling this up, and you'll say, but Sarah, why does this have anything to do with moderate? This is luxury spending in the United States, right? And the thing that I want you to realize here is it really fluctuates. And the consumer that is the wealthy consumer only spends half their money. They save half of their money. So as the stock market wobbles, they wobble. Notice Q1. Did the stock market wobble? Yes. So they didn't spend, even though we know that they went up 30% last year. So the wealth effect in real estate wasn't having an effect. But what we also know is that if you were online in a department store in March, all right, you had an increase of 14.3% in your business year over year. Your bricks and mortar was down 13.3%. So if your client can't use a smartphone, doesn't have internet access, doesn't have a debit prepaid card or a credit card, they can't shop with you during that period of time. And I think this is something that we as a society need to really make certain that, you know, our motto at MasterCard is a world beyond cash. And it's not just because it's self-serving because we run the switch, it's also because the fact is this enables people to actually participate in the economy, and that's the critical thing.
Ross, if I could just build on that for a second. I agree. I mean, we're the largest retailer in the U.S., and most people are surprised by the fact that only 15% of our sales are credit, and the other 85% are cash or debit. So the financial availability of financial products is not equal all the way through the economy, and as such, you would imagine our jewelry sales weren't, because you're reporting credit sales, that's not what the items are popping for us. Actually, our apparel business was quite strong.
Are we seeing any signs that the housing market is cooling down substantially when you look at what people are buying?
Well, if you pull up my slide 53, that'll give you sort of a good indicator. And what you can see is hardware has gone negative, all right? And that's a pretty big indicator because what was interesting was hardware actually, as you can see, was significantly positive in 2012. So we actually saw an increase in furniture sales and an increase in hardware back in 2012. Then you see it's really fallen off. The other thing that's interesting is we make a distinction between furniture and furnishings. So furniture, you buy a sofa when you buy a new house because you hate your furniture anymore and you look at it, right? You buy throw pillows and accents when you rent. And one of the things that we're seeing is this move of potentially not the same sort of household formations anymore, because I'm looking at, for example, cable bills and things like that, because we see all the service payments as well. So from that perspective, it is an important thing to understand that we don't think that the housing recovery would continue. We think your issue on affordability is really where we're at this point. Now, that doesn't mean that people aren't being able to move into a better home to rent and the like, but whether they will actually be purchasing a home is not necessarily something we're expecting.
See anything different, Bill?
We probably correlate some of that data. We see categories in an area of this business we call home, which are more of the furnishings that are really starting to do well, and we attribute that to people who are staying in their current residence and making it look better or fresher with a change in decor.
Right.
So we don't our hardware numbers aren't like that, but
right. But Ross,
yeah,
I was just going to say what's important to ask as well is not are there more homes? As a former Secretary of Housing for California, this is also an area of interest of mine, and I must say that I now ask our lenders, is it appropriate to have so many people invest all that they've got in a home?
Right. Sure.
I think that's a very fundamental question because, we used to always say that the American dream is to buy a home, and so many of the, of our good people across the country did. And when we had the downturn, how many people were underwater, right? So I think we have to now have a different conversation about what is the best investment and how do we turn this economy around, and is home ownership the answer? And so I would just sort of step back from that a little bit from time to time. Thank you.
Agree. Ross, I was going to
Jeff.
say, I think it's all tied to that same issue of confidence, though. As long as there's a lot of money on the sidelines, not being invested, waiting for certainty, then not everybody's going to be able to participate, which is why, as encouraged both Eric and Bill, I know in their companies are out investing for the future. I think we've got to get that confidence at the large corporate level that will spill down to the rest of the economy, including the consumers.
Are we starting to see CEOs and the board become more confident to be able to deploy the capital, whether it's for M&A, for capital expenditures? Eric, what do you think?
Well, I think absolutely. As I said, we see orders up over 20% year over year the last 6 months. But I think more importantly, we have seen the pipeline grow of major capital projects that that companies are planning. And particularly those, I would say, would be around the energy value chain and also the manufacturing value chain. So we're seeing, just in the last couple of months, we've seen the pipeline, our pipeline of companies interested in projects rise by over $100 billion. Basically things that they want to get started within the next 12 months we would put into our pipeline. So that's the biggest rise we've seen since we first started coming out of the recession in about 2.5, 3 years. So I think it looks like, first of all, people are making orders and spending a lot more, particularly on capital, on big capital. Secondly, we're seeing the pipeline grow, the interest level grow on projects that people see. I think the uncertainty is waning a bit. There was a lot of uncertainty the last couple of years. I think people have just decided that nothing's going to happen on Capitol Hill, so let's not worry about it anymore. I think we're seeing a lot more activity within the states to drive activity, and also within the cities are moving ahead with big projects. We're seeing a lot more interest in things like public-private partnerships out there. I think you're going to see probably the first high-speed train built in this country is going to be a private train, not a public-funded train. So I think that's the kind of interest you're seeing. So.
I would build on that and agree completely. I think after 6 or 7 years of not much happening and a lot of waiting, American business has to lead the way forward. The only solution is growth. Public policy can help or facilitate, but it can't actually grow. We have to grow, and it's going to require investment. It's going to require, in many cases, courageous investment in order to pull that off. And like Eric, we've found willing partners in city and state and local governments who are more pragmatic about their approach than political to be able to move forward with. And we're pretty optimistic that we're starting to see some traction.
I was just going to say, Dr. Duvall, that again, as being the spokesperson for the small business community, that currently, while small businesses employ 1 in 2, small businesses are generating the job growth right now. 2 out of 3 new jobs are coming from the small business community.
And that's the way it's been historically, but up until about a year ago, that wasn't the case.
And what we're seeing now is, and this is one of my concerns, is that in a globalized economy, more and more of the large institutions now are going to international sourcing. And so that could affect also our small businesses. And so what we're trying to do is we launched this new product called STEP. And STEP seeks to pull together small merchants, businesses, so that they can come together and do more international work as well. Right. But so I want to just, take this opportunity to encourage our larger companies to remember that to the extent that they can mirror what the public sector is doing, this 23%, then it allows the small business community to create jobs here in America.
Let's transition into manufacturing. I think this ties into the capital investment story. And I showed the graph on low natural gas prices in the U.S. And kind of the value chain. Bill, I know that Walmart's been very active in this space, and if we could queue up, we have a 60-second video we want to show here in just a minute. So we've seen strong gains in productivity in U.S. manufacturing. The dollar relatively weak, rising wages in China and throughout Asia, very long supply chain. And when you combine it with low natural gas costs, it's got to change the dynamics, the economics of where you locate. Yeah. So maybe if I could give you an opportunity to kind of talk about Walmart's efforts. But first, let's roll the tape, or I should say, roll the bits. Let's see the bits, and I'll ask Bill to follow up on it, please. Thank you.
At one time, I made things, and I took pride in the things I made. And my belts whirred, and my engines cranked. I opened my doors to all, and together we filled pallets and trucks. I was mighty. And then one day, the gears stopped turning. But I still here. And I believe I will rise again. And we will build things, and build families, and build dreams. It's time to get back to what America does best. Because work is a beautiful thing.
Bill, if you could give us some of the context behind that and just what you're trying to accomplish and what factors might be driving it while you're moving in that direction.
We're all about efficiency, and we're all about providing the lowest possible price and cost to our customers so they can spend their money on whatever they choose, not on necessities of life that are more expensive than they need to be. And we saw the same trends that you just described starting to emerge over the last couple of years, the same ones Eric was describing. We're at a generational opportunity to see manufacturing locate closer to the point of consumption. And American manufacturing for American consumption is the most efficient thing you can do. Obviously, Asian manufacturing for Asian consumption as well. And with you know, kind of a generational energy cost opportunity for us, with the interest rates at historic lows, we are seeing a reemergence of manufacturing in the U.S. And I always have to start with this caveat. We already, about 2/3 of what we sell in the U.S. are made here or grown here. We're one of the largest grocer in the U.S., obviously. So we're very U.S. focused in broadly. This is an opportunity for us to look at categories that when analyzed should be made in the U.S. And we worked with several third parties and completed the analysis, and Boston Consulting, with all due respect, sorry, helped us with some of the project. And they estimate that this $250 billion in and of itself will generate about 1 million jobs in the U.S. And about 3/4 of the jobs are small business jobs that are in the ecosystem around the manufacturing. So when large business grows, small business grows as well. And so it's exciting, it's an opportunity that we're seeing, and we have been able to have success in categories that are across a wide spectrum from apparel to toys to textiles to electronics and televisions to bicycles, the first American-made bicycle in probably 30 years, other than the real high-end plant just is going to open in South Carolina and not too long. So it's exciting that we're able to see this, and each of these items are able to get to market for the same or lower price than the import. And that wasn't the case 10 years ago. And we estimate that over the next 5 to 10 years, more and more categories will make economic sense to be made closer to the point of consumption. So we're on the front end of this thing. This isn't a Walmart thing, it's an American thing. We buy from the same factories in Asia as our competitors do, and we expect that when these are up and running in the U.S. that our competitors will buy from them as well.
Let me get to Eric, and then I'll get to Sarah. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe just a couple comments. I love that ad. If you go around this country today, you'll see thousands and thousands of facilities like the ones that you showed in the video. And what we're finding is one of the biggest growth areas for us over the last 2 or 3 years is going in and modernizing and rejuvenating a lot of those old plants, because the fact of the matter is a lot of them went out of business or were shut down not only for offshoring, but because they failed to invest in the latest technologies. And so what we're starting to see is just a huge rejuvenation of a lot of those plants. Now, there's a couple of big challenges that we're seeing as well. One is the modernization, which is coming back slowly. But secondly is the infrastructure around a lot of those facilities. We've opened 4 or 5 new plants in Kansas and Iowa and North Carolina. Every one of those we had to significantly upgrade rail spurs and roads and things. So when people talk about infrastructure, the infrastructure really is going to be key to driving growth in a lot of these plants that have been closed. You can imagine if you closed a plant 7, 8, 10, 15 years ago, just imagine what the whole infrastructure around. And the third thing is the people who used to work in those plants, 2 issues. One of them, the demographics are such that a lot of that workforce is aging and no longer around. The second thing is we haven't been training people to work in those kind of middle skill areas, working in those plants. And these are very high-paying jobs, well above the national average in paying jobs. But they do require some specialized training and education around those, and that has fallen off significantly. People call it the skills gap. I like to call it the training gap, because I think the onus just isn't on the educational system, but also on corporations to help with some of that training. But this is a huge issue that companies around the country are finding, and if we really want to use this opportunity we have with the energy advantage and the economy coming back, we're going to have to solve both of those problems going forward.
Yeah, just if I could real quickly, agree 100%. That's where we're seeing some really, really wonderful engagement from some of the great governors and mayors that we have locally. They understand that they've got to redefine, retrain, because the jobs aren't the same manufacturing jobs that left 15 or 20 years ago. They're much more high tech than they were, and then the rebuild of the infrastructure around those, because there's a real distinct first mover advantage for those that want to get involved at this stage. If they build that infrastructure that Eric talked about, not only one plant opens up. If you build a rail spur, you get the ecosystem that will be built around it, and build the next kind of manufacturing hub in the U.S. And so it's a really exciting time right now.
Sarah?
It's really good. It's really good for small business too, because when we open one of these plants and upgrade the infrastructure, you just see it attract dozens and dozens of small businesses around it who supply to us, but also supply more broadly to the market.
Which is exactly what I was going to talk about, because interestingly enough, this ancillary spend that we see that happens around these plants. So think about it. Last year, we sold 16.1 million cars in the United States. The average car has aged to 11.1 years, which has never been this old in our history. But what was most interesting is 72% of those cars were manufactured in the United States. Did any of you really know that? I mean, that's pretty amazing, right? And so the fact is that all those people, for example, there were bonuses in all those auto plants, all right? And those people went out and they went shopping with that money, and that's a really critical thing. So you can see that it lent to the small businesses that they went to, and the restaurants, and all the other things that people do when they have that type of increase in income. So I think that this is just one of the most important things we can do in the country because of this, because the fact is you see that the energy prices are low, and as the gas prices, I'm telling you, it didn't matter how much real estate prices went up last year. It didn't matter that the stock market was going up. Only 52% of Americans have money in the stock market. What mattered was the gas prices came down last year, and people had discretionary income in their pockets to go shopping at the stores.
Yeah, just two things. I think these concepts of ecosystems are really starting to emerge. We see large corporations realizing that in partnership with small business, there's huge opportunities to stimulate growth. The other is the point Eric brought up around this skill or training gap. I think with the pace of change in technology, what we really have to start thinking about is not just learning, but it's relearning. And that the truth is that companies are going to have to be in the business of taking more responsibility of training their people on new skills over time, because they're going to continue to evolve. We're in the talent business. We invest a tremendous amount of time in trying to keep our people proficient with the new economy. We built an entire facility geared towards developing leaders, and I think corporations are going to have to play a much bigger role in that going forward.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes, I just wanted to add that I'm so grateful that the point about skills training gap was raised, because as when I was here in state office, I was responsible for the state census count. And what I learned is, in trying to understand the demographics and how to deploy them, what we learned, and we just saw Wall Street write an article about it, that African Americans are still woefully behind in terms of accessing capital and opportunities. And so the president launched a My Brother's Keeper program to make sure that we address that skills and training gap. But I think we have to be mindful in general that America's a hugely diverse country. I'm an immigrant, as an example. And I think it's important to remember that right now immigrants are over-indexing in terms of patents filed, the contributions that our diverse country makes. And so I would hope that as we think about training, when I looked at the BRIC countries, for example, and took the African American, the Latino, and put them together, they rank just as high as any of the BRIC countries. I think they rank number 2 in terms of the BRIC opportunities. So I'm always hearing about every large corporation saying, we're going to go after the BRIC opportunities internationally, globally, while they're overlooking a vast productivity per person factor here in the States, and we have the infrastructure here already. And you have, the systems in place, the technology, a sound government that you can trust and feel comfortable operating in. So to the extent that we remember those underserved communities, I think we could go a long way too.
Well, and I'll also say in the rest of the world, the economy is not as rosy as the picture I'm painting here. So when I'm looking at spending around the world, it's actually significantly falling off a cliff and declining. And that's a real challenge for the rest of the world. You think about Brazil, 62.5% of their GDP comes from consumer spending, and they've got hyper food inflation right now, so they're not spending. So there's some real issues. So I think the focus back here is so critical because we should build on this momentum.
Jim, you made an interesting point on our call in preparing for the panel about service sector exports. We don't think about the service sector as being a leading exporter, but it is. And you do some of that, and some of your competitors attempt to. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in that market.
Well, there's a tremendous amount of expertise that's resident in this country, and a lot of it is extended through services globally. And so you take the expertise, whether it be in financial services or in what I do or in hospitality and leisure, those kinds of services are things that are robustly needed externally. Back to the point here, it's complex to operate at. We're all over the globe in every country. It's really complex. And what I'm also seeing is exactly what you're hearing from the other panelists, is more of a focus in the U.S. But services has clearly been a way for us to export our expertise externally.
Eric, a little bit more. You've been a leader in this in terms of trying to bring the vocational education or community college system into kind of the middle skills market training. Could you maybe point out a couple of areas where you've had some success in that, and maybe what some of the challenges might be?
Yeah, so to address the skills gap, some of the plants we've been opening, one in particular would be in Charlotte, North Carolina. We built a large gas turbine manufacturing plant, had to add about 1,000 jobs. We interviewed thousands of people, basically found very few, less than 50 people that were actually qualified to work on the production line. We were a year and a half ahead of building the plant, so we started a program with the local community college. We actually had to fly professors from the school over to Germany to be trained. We had to help them develop a curriculum. Basically, people weren't doing a lot around gas plant, turbine engineering, and manufacturing in this country anymore. There was some of it going on, but not a lot in those regions. But once we got those people trained, the thing we then had to do was we set up an apprentice program, much modified off of what we do in Germany. In Germany, at any one time, Siemens has about 10,000 apprentice employees. Basically, you hire them out of high school, you pay them while they work, they go to school half-time, they work in plants half-time, and then to begin their career, they have a skill, they have a degree, they have a paying job, and then they can go on from there in their career. That's kind of fallen apart in the U.S., the whole vocational training. So we've set up a couple of these apprentice programs, the one in Charlotte with the Central Piedmont Community College. And I think the interesting story is at first, we had a lot of trouble with parents and school administrators convincing them that this was a really good career. But once they understood that, your son or daughter is going to start getting paid the minute they graduate from high school, they're going to get a 2-year degree, and this is for production in a manufacturing plant called mechatronics. You're going to get a certificate from the state of North Carolina that's transferable to other states, and the starting job after 3 years is $55,000 a year. Here's the interesting fact. The average liberal arts degree after 4 years in this country is under $40,000 a year. These jobs, 3 years, I have no debt. The average liberal arts graduate has $20,000 in debt. So you have no debt, you have a skill, you have a job, it's the beginning of your career, you can always go back to school and go on from there, and you're making $55,000 a year. These are the jobs in this country right now where I talk to CEOs across many different sectors are finding people who have those skills. Even in the healthcare, in IT, manufacturing, in all these areas, people are having trouble finding those jobs. So we're trying to expand. I'm actually working on the President's Council for Advanced Manufacturing, and we're putting together an apprentice program like this. I think President Obama and Vice President Biden spoke about it a couple weeks ago, and we're working with other large companies and mid-sized companies to help set up some of these programs.
I just wanted to applaud that effort because that's particularly for small businesses. I talk to small businesses and they say, I don't need a CPA, I need a bookkeeper. You know, I need somebody that can come in and start addressing my books right away, and then I can watch them, help them, support them, continue their education, and then they become a senior bookkeeper as my company is growing. And then they finally become, you know, an accountant and a CPA eventually. And so that layering of education, so that we recognize those credits and allow them to layer their education, serves corporations in the long run, but also serves small businesses along the way. So thank you. I applaud that effort.
Yeah,
thank you.
I mean, I think it gets down to having to think about education differently. It's not just the educational institutions. I think an ecosystem of partners has to do it. It's community colleges, their support organizations, I think corporations. But we have to think about it differently based on where the jobs are. The one not so bright spot is the long-term unemployment issue. And I know a number of us have signed up for that as well with the president. It's something we're going to actually take a look at. But there's still 4 million people that have been unemployed for over 27 weeks. And that group is not, it started to move a little bit recently, but I think it's going to take exactly that type of program to go get underneath and figure that out, where a number of people are going to have to think about it differently and work together in communities to make a difference.
But I think it's as simple as, for us, for example, we're out in Purchase, New York, which is, for those of you who aren't aware, it's way out in Westchester. And we literally have a shuttle bus that comes out from the city every day and goes back, because we realized that we weren't getting people, you know, and young people especially, wanting to come out to the burbs. And so it was a really important thing. So it's just companies doing simple things like that that could allow us to expand our workforce as we were trying to hire, you know, another 600 people this year.
Eric, one thing that we discussed briefly, a lot of people aren't aware of this, but the R&D tax credit has expired in the United States again. It's not the first time. Let's hope it's the last time. Do you think this is harming, at least at the margin, deciding whether to deploy R&D to make that investment here as opposed to someplace else, whether it's Germany?
Yeah, I would say I would agree with Bill. I don't think we need to rely on the government for a lot of policies, but the R&D tax credit is a policy that was first developed by the United States, and it really encouraged bringing a lot of R&D here. We spend, just in the U.S., we spend over $1 billion a year on research and development, and I get questioned all the time about whether it's going to be renewed, because various businesses are making the decision, do I do this in Europe, do I do it in Asia, do I do it in the U.S.? And again, I said we also like to co-locate it with manufacturing, but there's always a question of how much do you co-locate based on that tax credit. And I got to tell you, a lot of other countries have been cranking up their R&D tax credits. Mm-hmm. And you know, we sort of renew it every couple of years, and sometimes it's back, you know, filled and things retroactively. But why not just put it in place and leave it in place, so companies know that if they invest here. And it also encourages more manufacturing investment. It encourages the development of more STEM education and people who are attracted to STEM education in the research field. And I think this country was a leader in that several decades ago. We've really fallen off. So,
what I'd like to do is to kind of, to wrap the panel up, get a sense of just where you think we are at now. We'll kind of ask the question, you know, can the global baton be passed to the U.S. to some extent? Where do you think we're growing? Are we growing at a rate, you know, close to 3% that will create jobs and help sustain the global economy, or is it less than that? Maria, maybe I could start with you and we can come on down.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the U.S. is positioned, first of all, when you travel to any country, they always say, we want American values. You know, you go to Israel, you go to Mexico. I've been to so many countries, and they all say that they want America to be preeminent. They know that we're the leader of the free world, and they want us to continue. And I think that even to the extent that others, you know, that when you travel abroad, that they sort of boo and hiss sometimes. You know, at the end of the day, when we're not present, they begin to complain. And so somehow we have to make certain that America is preeminent. And I think, as I said, I think we have to go with a double-pronged strategy to make sure that we have the proper mechanisms, policies, tax policies in place for the large institutions, but also for the small business person. And so to that extent, we're going to continue to gin up what I call the SBIR, so that you have the manufacturing tax, the R&D taxes, tax credits, but also that we have the incentive to continue to research and innovate. And we just held hearings in Seattle, and I was pleased to see how many companies showed up, institutions that showed up that said that they were taking advantage of our innovation and research. And America's got to make sure that we're innovating and then speed to market, patent it, so that while we're innovating, somebody isn't taking our patent and then bringing it back and selling it to us. So it's also just important that we patent it and then we deploy it and begin to ship worldwide so that we can maintain our preeminence.
Jim, where are we at? Are we?
Yeah, positive. I think we see it building in the second half. Next year, our forecast is about 3.4% of growth. But I'm going to go back to the same point. I think this R&D issue is huge. You've been starting to see the R&D investment go up. In the last year, I think 30% of the R&D and about 30% of the patents actually came out of the U.S. And that has been what's fueled our economy in the past, and I think we have to continue to double down on R&D, investment, and innovation.
Sarah?
Well, as you know, 70% of GDP is consumer spending. So I want to say that I think what's very important is the consumer is different than pre the recession. And they really are looking value for money. And we don't see them actually going for the cheapest. They're not always discounting. I'm not saying that it's not important, but what I'm saying is that the interesting thing that we see is that you don't necessarily have to discount to move merchandise. They want to spend. And so what I think is very exciting is that we see this wage pressure. We see the consumer coming back, but you have to think about what they want. And I think this is where, as we evaluate where big businesses are moving, that's the key thing.
Bill?
You asked if the U.S. was ready to take the baton for global growth, and I would tell you that we never lost it. We just forgot we had it.
All right.
And the only way out of this funk that we've been in is to grow. There isn't any. There are some, the R&D tax credit, there are other corporate tax changes policy that would certainly help. But American business and the American consumer has to decide that they actually remember that they do have that baton. We're at a generational, once in a generation opportunity to see an inflection point in growth. All of the variables that you analyze and we looked at that we talked about today are there. The consumer's rebounding. Energy costs, availability of capital. It's all right there. And if we don't take the initiative and drive forward, I think we'll regret it in 10 years. And I'm very confident. I think we're starting to see it happen. And I believe we're going to have a good year and probably a good 10 or 15-year run.
Great. Eric, you get the last word.
I'll just say quickly, I don't think a lot of countries don't get a chance at a second bite at the apple. Yeah. And I think with the advantage we have in natural resources and things now, this is a huge opportunity. I think it is an inflection point. We need to take advantage of it. I think 3% growth would be pathetic. I think we need to be shooting for something much higher than that. And I think if we get some of the things right that we just talked about here in terms of skills, infrastructure, and maybe a couple of these policies, I think you're going to see huge amount of investment here. And that's been the big problem in this country. Money's been going other places like the BRICs that was mentioned. I think a lot of that money is going to flow back here.
Well, thank you, Eric. Let's note that we ended on a fairly upbeat message today. And I want to thank all of our panelists for a very engaging opportunity to chat with them. Thank you.